Okay, I'm going to show you today a figure painting that I did not long ago, and I'm sorry I can't show the photograph that I worked from. This is a young lady that she's a friend of mine, and she was more than willing to pose, but I don't know that she wanted her photograph plastered across the internet, so you're just going to have to watch it come about on the white paper. The paper I'm using is Arches. It's a great paper. It's kind of the among watercolorists, sort of, I guess, be like the industry standard. I like it quite a bit, but I use a bunch of different kinds. I use Canson Montval, I use Langton, I use Gemini, Strathmore Gemini, and I like them all. They're just very different. So you just have to get used to what each one will and won't do. That's sort of the trick on a lot of the technical aspects of art, is just learning what any one particular tool will do. As you can see, I didn't do any preliminary drawing. In some instances, I like to draw. In others, I don't. I like to just jump right in and work with large masses, large shapes. And I'm putting down bright washes of color. Keep in mind, you can always dull a color down, but brightening colors up is much more challenging, whether you're doing it with oil or watercolor. It can just be, well, almost impossible at times to brighten something up once it's been dulled down. So you just want to, when you first start, really go in and very boldly put your color in. And also remember that in watercolor, because it's an aqueous medium, it goes down wet, brighter than when it dries. So whatever intensity you think it is and whatever darkness you think it is, if you think it's right, it's wrong. So when you're doing watercolor, go brighter, go darker than you think it should be. And when it dries, it'll probably be pretty well within reason what you wanted. Now, as you can see, I do not subscribe to nor see any evidence for the myth that watercolor is an unforgiving medium and that once you put it down, it's down and there's nothing you can do. Well, that's just nonsense. There's no, it's just not true. So don't be afraid to put stuff down, and if you need to, as you'll see as the painting progresses, you can correct, excuse me, you can correct all day long. You can use your brush to lift out color. You can move things around. In the end, you can go opaque if you want to. Now, I know there is a school of thought that, you want to preserve the white of the paper, and there's something legitimately to be said for that. But I don't care anything about it one way or another. So I'm just interested in the end result. And for me, it's quicker and easier just to put stuff down, and then when I'm ready, if I want to, I'll just pull it out. As you can see what I'm doing now, I'll take a damp brush and just start pulling the color out. Now, one thing to think about is that if you're using a paper like Arches, it stays wetter for far longer than, say, Canson Montval. Canson's Montval paper is not a rag paper. It's got a lot of wood pulp in it. So it dries much more quickly than any of your rag papers, because the rag papers have cotton and those fibers hold the water a lot longer. So you can put stuff down and come in and lift out Now, you'll see sometimes it'll jump, and that's just because I've cut where I may have used the blow dryer to speed the drying process up. And you'll tell that the colors are much duller, much lighter and much duller. So you have to go back in, and that's something with arches I've discovered is that there's a much stronger transit or difference between what the colors look like when they're wet as to when they're dry. There's a difference with casein Montval as well, but not nearly like with the rag papers. Now, and one reason I like to block in the way I've done is that it keeps you from painting in a coloring book style. There's the tendency, if you paint or if you draw very carefully your figure or whatever you're painting out, then you start painting within the lines and you're so afraid that some color is going to migrate over into another, from one area to another area. And so you wind up with these real hard edges, and the different parts of the painting don't always relate to one another very well. So you've just got these sections of color. And by coming in like I like to do and put these washes down that start bleeding into one another, then you begin to have a relationship from one area to another. Even if you cover it up, there'll still be some of that color that's bleeding through or coming through. If you look up where the head is, the orange that'll be in the hair bleeding down into her back, it later on, even if I start covering a lot of that up, there still will probably be little bitty ghosts of that area coming through, and that helps to give the two areas a relationship to one another. You can see that I'm kind of scrubbing the paper a little bit, and that's the thing, especially with I like rough paper. I think this is cold press, but I actually like rough paper better than I do cold press. The heavier the weight of the paper, 150 pounds, 300 pounds, something like that, it's more robust. So you can go in and lift color out by scrubbing into it. Now, you want to experiment. You want to see just how rough you can be. But normally what I do is take a brush, very often like an oil painting brush, a nylon. I wouldn't necessarily suggest a hog's bristle brush, although I've used those too. But you can use just a nylon brush, and while the paper's a little bit wet, just scrub it a little bit and then use a paper towel to lift. And yeah, you can get back to, well, you're not going to get back to the absolute white of the paper, but you can get real close. The one thing to keep in mind is that you've got what are called staining colors. And so things like the phthalo colors, they're going to have a tendency to stain the paper, and you're not going to get that out. But a lot of the earth colors and a lot of colors that just tend to float more on the surface as opposed to really sinking down into the fibers, they lift a whole lot more easily. So again, playing with colors, changing up your palette every once in a while is a good idea, because you learn which colors will do certain things, which ones are going to puddle up more, which ones are going to stain, which ones will granulate. A lot of watercolor painters, they don't like granulation. I do. I like the texture. It's not right or wrong. There's not a good or bad, right or wrong. It's just different. And if you don't like granulation, just search around, find people who will talk about that and who have done studies into which ones will and which ones won't, and then you can either steer away from those colors or go to them. Now, as I get into the face, I'm not necessarily interested in getting an exact likeness or anything like that. It's just having a pretty face. One thing I just cannot stand is figure painters and statues, sculptures that you'll see, and even if the figure is really well done, the face is just ugly. I personally, it's just a pet peeve of mine. I don't like it. And so even if I'm not trying to get a likeness, I still want the face to be attractive. Now, a lot of that comes from that I've been a portrait painter my entire career. From day one, I was a portrait painter. And I've just always been very sensitive to the face and how it looks. So that's me. If you like ugly faces, then go for it. But I like the face to be attractive. As I'm working along, I'm still trying to make sure that I keep my colors rich and intense. It's a real easy hole to fall into, where the more you work on a painting, the muddier and just nastier the colors become, the grayer they become. And it's because as you're working, you're continuing to mix the colors, and your green mixes with your orange, mixes with your blue, mixes with your purple, and all of those begin to cancel each other out, and hence you've got mud. So one way to combat that is, well, try to make as few passages as you can. And that, of course, is going to keep things from getting overly muddy. But don't be afraid of color. Don't be afraid to go in, and if you are wanting to paint something with red, paint it red. Really put some red down there. And if you want it to be green, put some green down there. Really make it have a statement. And that way, if later you want to, you can knock it down, you can dull it down. Boy, that's real easy. But if you've already got a lot of pigment down and it's already real muddy, then it's going to be a real challenge to brighten it up and get that rich intensity that you had originally. As you can see in this process, for me, it's almost like oil painting. I'm just carving the figure out back and forth. So again, this dogmatic attitude people have, or try to give people that, with watercolor, it's a one-way street. You go light to dark, and with oils, you go dark to light. Well, that's just, again, it's just not true. Actually, the best watercolor painters and the best oil painters go from the middle out. The John Singer Sargent was famous for it. He would start with a mid-tone and then work his way out. If you think about, most of your painting is going to be mid-tone. So if you get that right, then it's a question of popping in a few highlights, putting in a few darks, and you've described what you're trying to paint. So that's really what I try to do, is go from the middle out. And also, by working in large blocky shapes, one of the things that does is that it prevents you from having too many hard edges. Again, like we talked about earlier with the coloring book look of colors, where you put colors in and then you're terrified to go past the line because you don't want things to mix, which is actually the opposite. You do want things to mix so that there'll be some smooth transition. By the same token, if you get too locked into your drawing, then if your drawing is wrong, then you're terrified to do anything to try to fix it, instead of saying, okay, well, the arm is too short, let me just redo the hand and extend the arm. No, you'll try to incrementally move the hand along or move the foot along, and it's just disastrous. It never works. The best thing to do is just get in and either scrub it out or paint right on top of it and just reestablish it. And if you've got a blocky figure like what I'm working on, then you're not particularly wed to an area where you say, oh, well, I've put the back here, or I've put the hip there, and it can't be moved. Well, it wasn't there before. That mark you just made established it. And if you feel like, well, it's too far in, or it's not far enough in, you're not attached to it, so you can move it without feeling like you're losing anything. I heard a guy on talk radio years ago. He said something that I've always kept in mind and applied to my painting. He said, never fall in love with something that can't love you back. Now that is an incredibly wise piece of philosophy to latch on to, not just in painting, in your whole life. But we won't go off onto that rabbit trail. But just think about that. When you're painting, it is so easy to put down a mark, put down a passage, and it may be wonderful. It may be a great passage, but a little bit later, for whatever reason, it needs to be changed. It needs to be moved. Keep in mind that the painting is not about that one passage. It's about the whole thing as a unit. And if you get focusing on one area too much, you're probably going to ignore the bad parts of the rest of the painting, or even the good parts of the rest of the painting that need to be brought up and need to be accentuated for a look. You'll also see at times in this painting, again, that I take the opaque colors and just do washes on top of now right here at the end, I noticed that I just felt like it was too red around her hip, her thigh, the cushion and everything around the bottom. It was just too much red going on. And so I took some purple and just went on top of it and began to cover and soften it up. And what was nice, though, was that red really shines through and gives that purple a warmth that otherwise it might would have been way too cold. And so don't take the attitude that, well, I've got to change something, that you've screwed up. That's not necessarily the case. I mean, and even if you did, who cares? But just because you look and an area is not right, that's okay. You can, make lemonade out of lemons. If you've got an area that's too warm, going on top of it with cooler colors, it'll look better than if you'd have tried to have done it right immediately, because you wouldn't have gotten those lovely undertones coming through that give the painting depth and volume. So that layered effect you use to your advantage. Well, I think that about wraps that up. So thanks for watching. If you've enjoyed this episode of The Arthropologist, please hit the like button. And if you'd like to see more episodes like this, think about subscribing. I'm Bill Wilson, and I'm The Arthropologist.